Hey, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. Just to kick things off on a little bit of context, so this is the sort of a bit of a casual sync on the OKR discussion we've been having on the issue. So I will summarize from this, put this recording on the issue, and also summarize this discussion so the conversation can continue. One thing that I've been working on kind of alongside the what we do on the OKR and maybe like how we can do some self-serve is I briefly chatted with with some people, not everyone, but some people from Configure and from Package this week. And both of them actually tentatively are saying Q4 is better for a kind of collaborative effort for moving things. Now, Configure are much more likely to be flexible. They're like Q3, maybe Q4. So what I have suggested to Configure is that we will continue thinking that we will ideally use the GitLab agent service, but we'll figure out before we say for sure, we'll figure out what we would want to do there and what we would expect from them. And then I can go back to them and give them a slightly better idea of like how much time and roughly where in the quarter we might need their input. But what I am keeping in mind, don't worry about it for yourself for this conversation, but what I am keeping in mind as we try and define this OKR is whether we frame it slightly differently, just so that we don't have like a really hard dependency on Configure having capacity. Awesome. So maybe to kick things off, what I've suggested, but I'm completely happy for this to just be an open-ended conversation. What I've suggested might be a good use of this time was to try and get on the same page around the comment that I left, which is in response to your comment, Alessia, which is roughly here are the steps we think most, maybe all, but certainly most components would go through in order to reach a self-serve deployment. And then what I tried to do is pull out some of the details about, as we say, okay, if we wanted to do, for example, automated releases, when we talk about that, here is basically what we would want to have for that piece. So we have the sort of broad pieces, but I'm completely happy for this just to be a open-ended conversation. If someone like maybe who wants to kick it? Yeah, great.
I'll just jump in, and this may be a silly question, and I feel like to me it's actually really important because I think over the course of this whole conversation I actually realized that maybe I didn't really understand or clarify to myself and maybe to others within the team what we mean when we say self-serve deployments. So what I mean by that is, like, if you take what people do with take what a developer thinks of when they're developing the GitLab Rails component at the moment, do they consider that self-service? Do they consider that it's definitely hands-off, like they just have no involvement? So what do we mean? What do we want to, so two things, okay? What do we want to achieve by self-service deployments? Or what do we define that as in the context of what we currently do now? And two, and I know, Alessia, you've already touched on this already, is what is self-service deployments, and does that mean it's still self-service into this like 4 times a day cycle, or is it a more rapid cycle? Is it choose your own cycle? Like, what do we mean by that?
So I can give a little bit of an idea of what I would quite like to see. Now, I'm not going to put any timelines around this, like probably longish term. The main thing that I see people struggling with is the coordination with us and the timelines that we fully control. So I think to answer your question, okay. I think for now, no, someone developing in the Rails monolith wouldn't consider that self-serve. That would be auto-deployed. One of the big reasons is they can't really control anything. We choose when things get deployed, and we choose when things get rolled back, and they don't really have any visibility of that. So I'm thinking self-serve to be a stage group has the freedom to control their rollouts, and ideally they would also be responsible for the rollback. So maybe that, like, hopefully that's automated, but I'm thinking that they would have, I mean, ideally they would have a pipeline that we basically help them give them, and they run it, and it puts their stuff in production safely. And if it doesn't work, it takes it back out of production safely.
Right. So yeah, no, that makes sense to me. So it's kind of like, if I think about the auto deploy process we have today, there's, and I kind of briefly touched on this, I think, in a comment on the issue. Like, there's two parts, right? There's when we tag, when we decide to deploy, which is just at the moment some arbitrary times of the day, right? Like I forget what the times are, but this time we're going to quote unquote deploy. This time we're going to deploy this. Well, actually, we're going to release and deploy, right? Because we kind of consider that as a release. Like, we're going to cut this release and try and deploy it. So there's that part, which obviously I get now that you kind of talked about that they don't have any control over. This is like, well, these are the times we're going to cut a release and away we go. And then there's the second part, which auto deploy does, which is the safety part. It's like, I'm going to go to staging canary, I'm going to run some tests, I'm going to go to staging, I'm going to run some tests, I'm going to bake, I'm going to like, and that's kind of like the second part, right? Like, independent, because we can change how often we release and how often we tag, but the deployer part of auto deploy, that rolling out safely, is like a fixed thing. It's like we're defining the points of time we release, and then that process itself is actually doing the rollout. So really, then
just on
I guess
that as well, Graham, though, sure. I think the process bit is the bit where what our kind of future ownership will still land, right? So I think as delivery orchestration,
yes, absolutely,
what we will do is actually be maybe not enforcing, but strongly advising, and in some cases enforcing. Like, every change must go through these, it must pass through these gates in order to reach production.
Right. Yep.
We just hopefully won't be the ones having to press the buttons, and we won't be the ones having to declare an incident because this pipeline failed. I think it would be much healthier if the stage groups got to own that.
Okay. So that makes sense. So once again, I'm just thinking internally, like, so if we split those two things off, we have what auto deploy does now, which is that safety rollout through environments, which I think is reusable and I think is, pretty well established, pretty well known about. We've got the whole post-deploy migrations part there as well and things like that. So the next question is, and this is, Alessio, I guess you've already touched on this and I'm interested more in your thoughts, is do we still have this like one auto deploy pipeline, or does auto deploy pipeline become something that every component uses? Like, so there's multiple repos running an auto deploy pipeline. Like, each component is running their own auto deploy pipeline. Obviously, we need to lock and like make sure they don't go over the top of each other and things like that. Or do we still keep this model of there is only, the one auto deploy pipelines run in this one repo, and we feed in component changes into that?
This is a great question. So I think this is far, far, far away in the future. And so let me start with something which I think is important to clearly understand and has to be clear for everyone in the team, which is we tend to consider auto deploy and monthly releases, patches releases as two separate processes, as two completely different things. Even in release tools code base, they are coded separately, even though they are exactly the same thing, barring some changes like no change log management. So everything was made to enforce a distinction where there's no distinction at all. And that's causing, what is the problem here? The problem is that auto deploy runs daily. I mean, more times a day, but basically the basic unit of time is a day. How many times I deploy a day? How many packages I build a day? So it's something that begins with the beginning of your day and ends with the end of your day, and tomorrow is another day and can be a fresh start. So that's the thing. But as soon as we enter the release preparation week, those two processes collide, because the last known deployment is the entry point to the stable release. And this is something that is quite unique to our company, because we do both SaaS and on-premise installation. So we get the extra challenges here. So what is the point here is that we do release what we tested. That's okay. So we deployed something so we can release to customer. Up until now, the central point where everything removing registry for other reasons, is stored is the GitLab repo. There are reasons for this. For instance, not every component, but many have integration tests within the monorepo, so that when we do build a CI test for Rails, we are compiling the version of Gitly that is declared. We are compiling workers, and we are testing that workers works with that, and that Gitly is actually behaving correctly, right? So that's the reason why things are referred as a version in Rails. When we do tag, we collect those versions and propagate them to the packagers, CNG and Omnibus, so that from that point on, those packages, when they're tagged, they contain the right version, the expected version. I mean, okay, so that's the thing. Now, all this complexity starts from development and goes through packages, then delivery. So it affects everything in the engineering function of this company, right? So it is now safe to say that if things are aligned with this model, then we can safely consider this unit as this is the release, the monthly release, and we know what's inside the release. We know that we tested. We are not even yet there because there are components that are getting outside of this. But let's say we get everything in line with this. So everything as a single source of truth inside GitLab or GitLab as a version file. And then we can deploy from a SHA instead of a release. So the version can be a SHA or a commit. Then basically, we can build the CNG images out of this, and then they will be part of an auto deploy with an automated rollout with all the safety mechanism and everything we care about. And then let's say we are at this point, we already have a struggle with development team on the 22nd, because if we work on SHA, then how do they release on the 22nd? So that's one problem. So let's say we do.
Sorry,
yeah,
just to be clear, a SHA in GitLab or GitLab, like that, a SHA in that repo, but they will still have defined version for their component.
No. So okay, let me. So if you take a look at GitLab or GitLab Gitly server version, the version file, there is a SHA inside. There's no version.
Okay.
There is a SHA on the Gitly repo, and basically we built Gitly from that SHA. And so the Omnibus package, the CNG packages, whatever they are built from SHA. When we start the release process, a release tools from that SHA creates the stable branches and creates the tagged release, which has the same tag of the product version. Now, when we hit this point, we have options like automated update like Gitly. So Gitly is just scanning for the latest master commit and updating the version file in autonomy. Or you can just say developers can change the SHA when they want to release a specific, they want to not release, that's the point, they want to deploy something. You want to deploy this commit, write me the commit, then by the 22nd, I'll make sure that this will be part of the release. If we are at that point, then we can start thinking about independent deployment, which is the thing that you touched on, which is, do we really want to deploy as a monolith every single component together? No. I mean, Gitly team wants, they have assumptions like this is gonna be deployed before. And so unless they are willing to have more freedom and then have more stability around the order of deployment, the status quo right now is that Gitly goes first. So when that's something, but let's say registry is independent. Okay, CAS could be independent. So I do understand the need of independent deployment, but this poses new questions like, how do we know what to release on the 22nd if we are no longer referring to those version files? So what I'm thinking right now is that speaking with developers, at least CAS developers, because registry has a different view on it, but CAS developers, they're struggling more with the release process than with the deploy process. So they will be fine with 6 deployment a day if they don't have to touch the release, but they're doing just 1 release a month because they have to do the release process manually and it's painful. And this open up the new set of questions, which are the link between deployment and releases, which is we do patch releases, we do security releases. I've been involved in doing a security release for Pages. It was 8 to 16 merge requests because it's completely manual. You have to do the fix on Pages, do the backports 4 times, do a changelog bump 4 times, do a tagging 4 times. All of this is manual. And then the version file has to be reported on 3 stable branches plus master, so other 4 merge requests. The amount of people involved in doing this was plainly wrong. It was done wrongly as well, so it's been a week just working on how to fix this thing.
So the question is then, do we want to provide a service or a way for people to do cutting releases, or is that something that if like that's what I don't understand is cutting a release just a developer's or a component's own problem? Like, and we only care about when they've cut the release and we'll deploy it, or do we also own that problem of cutting releases for them? Or
so that's the one good question that we have to answer, which is in theory we should not force anyone, but we should just say if you want to adopt this model, we can handle everything for you. Right. But if you want to tag your own release, it's fine as long as I have a way to figure out what's inside every product versions that I release. Because now, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, no. So I think you're right. I think so. So I guess there's 2 parts. I think you're right. I think we need to really push hard on this versions file in GitLab or GitLab. Like some people, I think we've got most people there, but we do need to make sure, because that's really our component inventory. And even on the issue where we talk about, like, even at the low level, like what container images do we deploy in Kubernetes, like trying to map all that. At some point we need a source of truth for what components we want to deploy or run and what their versions are. So, and we've got that with the GitLab or GitLab repo. I do pose the question whether we should push that into its own repo or something, and even the GitLab project maybe feeds into that, and we define like a proper open API model for defining the components and maybe even solidifying that. And even for components we don't ship, we could even force them to go in there because it becomes an inventory of all the software we are able to deploy. So that's like that could be one way to look at it. But so I agree. I think we need to push hard on people who aren't in this inventory to be in this inventory. We can't, no matter what, we should pushing people to be in that inventory, because you're right, then we can like auto deploy or Kubernetes, whatever, like we have our processes from there that can do it, and we need to be able to cut that patch release, month release, whatever from there. Whatever this inventory is, it needs to be in there. I guess the question is before that. So if they like their own release process, like do developers choose what goes into that inventory? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Do developers
That's in my table, that's the automated update section, which means as long as the interface point between delivery, let's say delivery, and development team is the version file. If you want to run your own release process, then you will bump your version file with a tag release. And we will roll this out. If you want to say, no, I want to have all the automation in the world that you can provide, then I will, two options. Either implement an automated update like GitLab, which say every hour, check the status of master and bump, or developers choose themselves. I want to do a release, script, chat ops, manual, whatever, just bump that file, and then from there, everything moves on. But there is an important question that you briefly touched on, which is build reproducibility. Yeah, you understood. So the thing is, right now there is a clear order of action, which is you either release or you have a release-less with SHA deployment process. Then you bump the version in the tracking version file. This kicks a Rails pipeline that, depending on the component, may trigger integration tests with the versions that you put in there. And this then result when we tag a release, deployment, and everything. Now, if we want to do something different, like independently deployed component, an independently deployed component means that, in theory, that could be deployed before the version is bumped, because we no longer have the link between registries running version 1 and there is an auto-deploy package that has version 1 inside of it as a tracking information. We can't guarantee, because as long as we split the two elements, they get independently deployed, so the tracking will no longer work. So if we go down that route, then we have to cleverly think about how we want to reconcile things, because then someone could say, yeah, but we have integration tests in the Rails repo and they were not run. So you may end up deploying something to production that didn't run that type of test. So that's an important question to answer. And
hang on, just to summarize on that. Yeah. So hang on, I think I feel like I was thinking something else, and then you just made a different, sort of an additional point. So on the first piece, you're saying that we need to, in order to enable properly self-serve deployment, where a stage group has their own pipeline and pushes to production, we need to flip the order, I believe, of the versioning. Is that correct? So we will need a more robust, independent way of keeping track of which component versions we have in production.
Yeah, which is the inventory that Graham was mentioning.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think
storing somewhere else.
And then the other piece we have is, as part of those independent pipelines, people won't necessarily get as much like free testing as they maybe do right now. Is that right? Like right now,
it's more about the integration test.
I'm kind of thinking that even if people want to do their own, I'm kind of like I say people can't avoid the inventory. I say they have to use it, like they've got to. What I'm trying to think is, even if you're like, or for self-serve deployments, I think the model should be, you still need to kind of like, the trigger point is is like a commit to some inventory, GitLab or GitLab somewhere. Like, I don't think you can just completely bypass that. If you want us to ship it in a self-managed release, I think the process should be, you can't write your own.
Yeah, that's exactly it. What I think we'll do, right, is, so think about self-serve in terms of, I think we get to a point where we offer people choices. So we'll say, you can just do your own thing and we won't have anything, we won't do any pieces for you. You can go off and do that if you want. So whatever the one that you were looking at the other month, Graham, applied machine learning applied. Anyway, they were like, we're going to be fully independent.
Yeah.
What's it called?
Yeah. It was the unreview.
And they were like, we are doing our whole own thing. We're owning everything. Like, great, go do whatever you feel like. Or you join auto deploy And then we say, you will do this, this, and this. And this is what I was trying to get at in my comment on the OKR issue. I think we should say we kind of have like a minimum set of requirements that you have to meet. So if you're part of auto deploy, you do this, this, this. If you're going to be whatever the next stage is, like whatever we call the GitLab model, you have to do this, this, and this. And if you're going to be doing self-serve, you have to do this, this, and this. And people then, we can then say, you must be putting version files here. You must, I don't know, you must have tests or a way to feature flag or whatever we actually need to put in place to put some sort of like some coordination around this.
I would try to release the requirement on testing, because these are the things that are slowing us down and that are making harder the switch to independent deployment, because then we have the problem that I was mentioning, which is how did we test things together, and more toward having stable, sensible metrics so that we can check at time of deployment. And this will help us test independently, because then you can deploy independently and we can still validate on metrics more than, and then you can still have your integration test as part of your own component CI thing, but that's another topic, right? So don't, because if we want to go in serve independent deployment model, so we can't enforce tests to run on the Rails side of it. If they are there, better. So GitLab introduced there's a gRPC endpoint. So it's good to compile, it's good to verify the endpoint and things like that, but still, it should still work with slightly different version of it. And there is something that we can consider as an intermediate point, which is, let's say you want to have deployment as part of your own pipeline, so independent deployment. I'm still thinking you already have implemented everything else. So you have automated release, automated tagging, automated everything. What we can think about, because both CAS and registry, they first deploy on pre with their process. So we could do something like this. We give you the pipeline that you can import that results in a pre-deployment. We may even consider rolling out to the canary stages after that. But then going to production is always in sync with deployment, with the auto-deploy promotion. So something like we have, let's say we have an accumulation point before the main stages, and when we promote, we collect versions of everything. So we know the package is included that, but then we also know that the independent component were on version this, and that, bundle things together and promote. It's still a monolithic approach, so it has downside, but it kind of put a point in time where we were propagating changes.
So
I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea, because it is kind of a halfway point with what we're doing. I'm kind of wondering as well, like, and I guess this comes back to what do people want to do? Do we want them to be able, so do they want to be able to have deploys in their own pipeline, so in their own projects, or for example, we still, like, we could set up a repo or set up something where pipe for each component, so like a delivery / component, whatever, that's just for deployment for that component, and the auto deploy pipelines for that component run under there, but they're not in their own pipeline. But those pipelines are triggered by the inventory change, so they still have to be like in staging. I'm changing the inventory file for staging to say we are going to, or maybe actually that's not right. I want to deploy this version, either by an automated tool or manually or whatever, into our inventory, like our GitLab All inventory or whatever it is. And then that triggers a downstream pipeline that we still own, but they can do, like, they can watch, they can monitor, they can do it, but it's not in their I guess what I'm trying to understand is, do they want to be able to do deploys in their own repo, because then we have to set them up permissions and everything and stuff to deploy in their repo? Or can we still give them access to a repo or something that's doing pipelines, but it's still not in there, or, you know, it's still triggered by this component change, which is the intent to deploy a new version. And then that triggers something, but we still own it in a separate repo, but it's still, you know, for their component. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. It's a good question. I'm kind of scared by the complexity of allowing every single component to have access to every cluster and have correctly set up deployment pipeline. And it sounds more like a nightmare.
Yeah. So that's why I'm like, do we should like basically saying, no, you can't have your own pipelines, you know, just doing deploys, but we'll give you an interface through this, you know, you bump this version here, and that will trigger in this project that we have for you, that you do have, let's say, developer access or maintainer, or something where you've got at least some like level of permission. You can watch the pipeline, you can, I don't know, it's still a separate repo from that ownership.
I think that maybe Registry Stream thought about it, but I think that any other team ever thought about something like this. They are so far away from having something like this. Many may not even, I mean, Elasticsearch indexer is not really changing that often. The GitLab shell had a burst of development when we moved from the Ruby versions to the SSHD Go developed version, but they tend to be quite stable.
Work this stuff out. Like I feel like that one will be a good one for us to do an evaluation and figure out like what would it look like if it was in one place versus the other. And this is really why I'm keen that we have a team we can collaborate with, so that to answer all your questions, Graham, where you're sort of saying like, what do they want? Do they want to do this? Honestly, we don't really know. We're going to need to go and work with the stage group to actually figure this out with them. The first one, I think, will be very much something tailored specifically to that component. But I'm hoping from there, we'll learn enough to put a generic model in place that we can kind of just roll out to other components. So for this one, it does sound like it will be as a case of us figuring out what options do we have, what are the pros and cons, like where's the complexity, where's the compliance risks, where are the permission problems, and then actually from there trying to work out like, do we have options here? I hope we do, but honestly, I don't know. I think that would be something we'll just have to do as sort of part of the work of the actual implementation.
Yeah. We were also thinking, I don't remember if you briefly touched on this at the beginning, Amy, or not, if there was a chance to dog food CAS, to deploy CAS. So we were thinking about maybe so that we learn how the tool works and how operate, and see if because that may be the central inventory we were discussing before, right? Because it can work in GitOps mode. So we could have the central inventory, which is CAS enabled and do the deployment. And so we're thinking something like we can install CAS on Ops and use it and put the agent on pre, so that we start doing the deployment on pre using CAS from Ops. That's a nightmare in terms of environment, but yeah, so that we before we commit to say because as I say, independent deploy in the timeline that we describe is kind of came after other things. So in the meantime that we get closer to give people independent deployment, we also figure out if the tool is okay, if we need something more, or if we want to do go on a different road.
I think the thing with CAS is it's basically it's like, I like the tool. I think it's got a lot of room to grow, but it's for our problem here, it's at a very low level. I still think we should do this. I still think we should use it and we should dog food it, definitely. But it's basically like, so it really comes into the whole GitLab com repo problem. And the problem of, once we have the component versions, they will feed into something. I don't know what, JSON, KPT, customize something, and it will output the manifests, and then CAS will deploy that on the cluster for us. So it's kind of like, it will be a step in the CI job that will replace Helm. It really just is a way to say two things, right? Once we get these inputs in, at some point, we need to have a repo, probably GitLab com, where we define a commit that's like, generating what the Kubernetes manifest will look like based off these inputs, based off the Helm chart, based off the configuration, and based off the versions. And then, you know, that gets committed to that repo, and then Kaz will deploy that on the cluster. And the value there we get out of that is really the confirming if the deploy went correctly, right? So it's got the reconciler it uses is based off the Kubernetes upstream one. So it's very solid in determining, like, yes, the pods are rotating, things that are going well, or no, they're not. And then we can get the feedback from that. So really that would involve, if we were to look at that part, that comes to probably that epic I've got talking about, like, how do we change GitLab COM or do a better model for like taking these inputs and outputting something that's consumable in a pure GitOps way. But still, like, that's fine. Like, even what I'm thinking about now, like, if one of those inputs at the moment, so here, you know, one of the inputs into the GitLab COM repo, the problems we have at the moment, right, is the input for the version numbers is a pipeline environment variable. And that's obviously tricky for many different reasons, for abusability, for people doing locally and stuff. If we are able to lean more on people getting things into the GitLab org inventory as the definitive way to deploy the new versions of components, then that can become an input into whatever tooling we choose with Kaz combined. Like some tooling to render the manifests out with Kaz applying it, and we can build a very strong pipeline there of inputs come in, manifests are rendered, we apply them safely. We can maybe monitor metrics or something as well to just make sure things are going okay, and, you know, fail out or maybe even roll back or something if things change. Probably roll back, right? Like if things have changed. So that's a good loop we can build with Kaz. The question will still be from there. Well, I guess that's kind of it. The question is the input. So Kaz and the GitLab COM repo just become a pure repo that is just a low level definition of the state for Kubernetes. Like this is what the state of things are in Kubernetes. There's a service, there's a CLOD, there's a pasta. It's still like auto deploy or something that's got the logic of we need to change to feed into that to say we need to change the state of staging canary. Now we need to run QA. Okay, now we need to change the state. So I certainly think, like, obviously I've got many ideas and want to change that low layer of just how do we feed in the inputs? How do we like generate outputs from that cleanly and easily for everyone to see? And how do we apply that to the cluster using Kaz or something safely? I mean, Kaz has things like CI tunnel built in, which means you don't have to give our runners access to the Kubernetes clusters. The other thing actually talking about self-managed deploys as well actually is, now that I think about it, is it actually does. This is the one thing I remember when I was working with the team on designing it. It has a robust permissions model that works with GitLab permissions. So actually thinking about this more, if each component, and this is a whole other technical discussion I don't want to bog us too much down into, but if each component at a Kubernetes level gets their own namespace, right? This is the registry. We deploy everything in the one namespace number. We just jam everything together, right? But we could do better. We could isolate them out and say, this is your namespace. You each get an agent, and all the agent can do is talk to that namespace. Because when you set up the agent, you give it's a pod, you give it the permissions only in that namespace. So you enforce it, everyone gets an agent only in their namespace. Then you can actually connect it to their own deployment projects. Like in GitLab, you can give it permissions to whatever group, project, or whatever. And they can't, for example, they've got no credentials to access production clusters because Kaz pulls from Git. It just goes, I will pull from this Git repo and apply the manifest. There's no CI job that can actually like mess with the cluster. There's nothing. So maybe that's the way we do use Kaz, to be like, to give developers, if they want that kind of access, more access, but in a safer way. And then simply what it becomes then is, what you need to give us is you need to have we either provide them one or they come up with their own Git repo of rendered manifests. Well, I guess we have to provide it because, see, we've got the GitLab Helm chart. Like that's another input into all of this.
Yeah, because we have to include that as well.
Yeah.
So let's not get too deep on this one. Just as let's
sure.
keep it in mind, just for two reasons actually. One is, I think the self-serve stuff will come quite a bit
Yeah,
later.
sure. Yeah.
But also this is very much in the system realm. So
Yeah.
I don't want us to make too many decisions around
Sure.
this without including that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
There is something worth mentioning though, which we didn't touch in all this conversation, which is by design, how things were comes from the interaction from development, package, and us. In order to have an image for a component on CNG, we must tag an auto-deploy release. So this is something important to keep in mind, because right now, thinking about CAS. So let's say CAS want to deploy from SHA. In order for CNG to have that image built, the SHA should be on the version file on GitLab, and we should have tagged an auto-deploy so that we propagate the versions to CNG. Without that, there's no package being built. Because they were doing their own packaging, and they were forced to move into the CNG. So CNG is acting as a gatekeeper. So when we talk about independent deploy, I still strongly believe that we should talk about SHA-based deployment, because release is another problem. Releasing is another problem, and it's our problem. So, but then we need a way from development team to have an image built that they don't have right now.
So where does that fit in? Like, is that part of like the automated rollout step, or is that literally something that happens that becomes a problem once we get to like independent?
It's a problem on independent deploy.
Okay, let's park that just for now. Just want to make sure we use the last 15 minutes. I just want to kind of like see if we can get on the same page for a few things. Do we roughly all agree that having everything go into auto deploys as they exist right now is the first step?
I'm thinking that might not be a bad step by the sound of it, right? Like at the end of the day, if everyone's getting into auto deploy, it's probably not a bad first step. But what do you think, Alessio?
Yeah, I do agree. The only two components that we know that are outside of it are CAS and registry, and GitLab metrics exporter, but it's still in development, so it will be part of it. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. And for registry, there is an extra step, which is not tracked on GitLab or GitLab for historical reason, because it was a third-party component, and when we forked this out, it never got integrated. So this means that we can't, even though they create the file, we can't propagate the versions, because Omnibus is expecting this on a different type of, it's a different definition. It's inside the Ruby file and not inside a version file. So there is an extra work there too.
But should we fix that now? Like, is now
Let's
the time to bring it?
No.
Okay.
No, let's do that in Q4 when we work with registry. Just because they've got the added complexity of their migration. So I don't want to change things on registry unless we really need to.
But aren't they looking at auto deploy? Like that's what? Yeah. Okay.
No, not right now.
Sure.
No,
not right now.
Okay. Not right now. No.
Okay.
So given that, then right now we have pretty much all of our release tooling set up to be around the monthly package, right? Like pretty much everything is designed so that we feed into that process. Is that still the right thing? Like, if as a kind of product direction, we're now saying we're SaaS first, like if we start thinking around for sort of like serve deployments, that's very much SaaS first, and we're seeing more and more components that are not really going to self-manage, or certainly not going to self-manage yet. Do we actually want to change anything around how we handle, I guess, how we handle creating packages for self-managed users to actually flip this over to be SaaS first? Or do we think that the model we have right now is still the right one to have for the next like 6 months, 12 months at least?
So what are you exactly thinking with this, Amy?
So I'm thinking really about the way, I guess what I'm thinking about is the how we keep track of what's in a package. Like, is now a good time to actually separate that out? So actually what we keep track of is what's on production. And from there, we say the package is all the latest stuff that's on production versus...
That's already the case. Because it's a bit tricky. So it should be already the case. We are doing this. Problem are CAS and registry, because they live outside of this. Depending on timing, we could end up releasing the wrong thing. That being said,
summarize why that is for me.
So yeah, sure. So CAS do manual releases aligned with the milestone. So they create their own release some days before the 22nd, and they bump the version 5, putting the release version in there. So if this thing gets deployed to GitLab.com, it will be part of the release. If not,
this is the automated release step. Is that correct?
Yeah. This is no. This is not automated. This is manual.
No, sorry, but in your definition of the step we would want to go towards self-service, this the problem that you have defined under automated release, the fact that they have to create a manual release. This is something.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is. But I was explaining. You were asking about where is the connection between what we deploy and what we release. So what I'm saying is that regardless of how we name things, so removing the name of the component, the versions they have, we release what we deployed on production. Registry, not for registry, because of another reason as well, because it's not tracked on the main repo. So we just take whatever versions is in Omnibus and in CNG, because it's independently upgraded. So that being said, we release what we have deployed in production. And for Gitly specifically, we even disregard the content of the version file, and we enforce getting the SHA of what is running in production. So we create, because this is the release is automated there. So we say, okay, now it's release time. I know because I tracked that this is what I deployed. I'm gonna release for you from there, and this will be in the release. It always aligns because the processes are made in lockstep. So the SHA is the same, but to double check and say we roll it back or we did something, we enforce getting the version from production. That being said, it's already that we release what we deployed. So
do we know that? Like, do we know for a given package? Do we know what those versions are?
I think this is what Graham's told about the fact that the metadata file are not the same for auto deploy and non-auto deploy, and that's why I said we are doing the same thing, but we are doing with 2 different classes that are handling the process in a different way. So if I remember correctly, when we do an auto deploy bump, an auto deploy tag, we dump versions of everything inside of it. When we do a monthly release or a patch release, so say a customer release, an on-premise release, we don't. We only track the versions of the main component and the packagers.
Start doing that? Is there benefit to doing that? Like in the
yes, it is. I'm not sure if we want to do this way or if we want to merge the 2 processes together, which is most valuable at this point in time, because they will keep diverging.
And if we brought them together, like what would that look like?
So right now, no, I mean, in terms of release tools, right now, if we say we are tagging auto deploy, or we are tagging, the name we use is public release. Or if we're tagging a public release, we are going in two different code paths. They are it's the same thing re-implemented with taking into account the variation between the two processes. One has changelog, the other one doesn't. One involves tagging of every single element inside of it. The other one only tags the packagers and propagate version files. So there are some differences, but at the end, they're doing the same thing. They just skip shards from component, they propagate versions to the packagers, and they tag the packagers. So we need to take a look at the code and figure out if it makes more sense to just align the metadata generation, or just put the two processes inside the same code path. Because okay, there's a horn. I don't know if you can hear, but someone is playing with a horn. Okay, so because there, I'm just giving an example. The metric exporter is being integrated in release tools, and one of the things that we mentioned is that they did a partial implementation because they didn't figure out that there are two processes, one for auto deploy and one for public releases, and they basically had to implement versions bumping, version propagation, sorry, in two different places. So, I mean,
okay, so we need to take a look at this, right? So it doesn't sound like there's necessarily a great value in doing this, but also there is some overhead of not doing it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on, Leonard. So last few minutes, and I'm
still trying to understand. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think you're about to say this anyway. Like, I'm still struggling to try and figure out what we can do concretely as an OKR.
Yeah, exactly. I was literally going to get, that's exactly it. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to home in on. What I'm actually wondering, right? So we know from your fun this week at SEO with the pages security release, we know there's some value there in getting them into auto releases, right?
Yeah.
I don't have all the details. I'm hoping you'll have time this week to maybe point us to some details things, but just like assume that we can kind of comprehend getting pages to have automated releases, and know that would help us on the security side. I'm fairly confident we could get the GitLab agent service into auto deploys. I think the configure will have capacity and willingness to do that. And perhaps we also take them to automated releases as well. And that gets rid of some of that manual overhead, right? So then we have three really kind of concrete steps towards two components, are then some steps closer to being possibly available for self-serve. We also have a quarter then to really figure out what self-serve might look like. What do people really want? Answer some of the questions you've had, Graham, around, do people want things to be in this repo or that repo? We could actually get that stuff figured out this quarter. But it doesn't sound like a whole heap of foundational work. And I know we do have loads and loads of foundational work. Those are really nice visible things that I think fit really well with an OKR. But I think what it might be really useful for us to do is to use this conversation and all the kind of conversations and thinking we've had around moving towards self-serve. Let us assume there is going to be at least one, probably most components that will benefit from having independent deployment, even if right now we're saying it's not immediately there. In that event, what do we want to change? And let's see if we can get some of that work. So I know, like, we've got health checks, let's go, you mentioned. We've got the work you've been doing, Graham, on environments and how we manage those better. We've got I think there is definitely some interesting stuff we could do around versions. It sounds like there's lots of different pieces. One thing we've always kind of struggled with is the fact that we do have this whole metadata project in existence. It's completely outside of the product. We are not the only people tracking these versions, right? Literally everybody deploying code must need to be tracking versions in some way. So I think there's some big pieces like that that could be the kind of the center point of work for the quarter. And then the actual OKR itself could just be, we get a couple of components moving in the steps towards self-serve. How does that sound?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I think probably I won't speak for Matt, for definitely myself as well. Just things like getting a component like CAS into auto deploy, I think would be a good learning experience for what that process is, and understanding auto deploy more as well.
Okay, I also want to say that CAS is really well designed for this move, because there are no problem with version names and things like that. They are willing to have it, so it's a perfect fit. Pages, on the other hand, they would like to. They have the fresh wound of the security release that is a nightmare because it's not yet completed, but there is a big important gap, which is Pages is currently running its own independent release with an independent version numbering. So the biggest things to sell them is that now you're going to be released with the same versions of GitLab. It was okay with the previous management when Pages was on release on the release stage group. But now it has new maintainers. It's part of a new stage group. So I don't know if they're still.
Which stage group does it live in now?
Would they have static webs? I don't remember.
Oh, I can look it up.
We should check.
We should check. Yeah, this I think all fits so well with what you were talking about probably a couple of months ago, Graham, about like just literally there are no standards across the organization for versions. I think this is a really good time for us to actually be able to put that in place and actually say, if people want things like this, this, or this, here's what your versions look like, and here is where they live. And if they don't, hey, come talk to us, right? But I think we can probably start enforcing that a bit more than we have.
Yeah, in any case, it's the only way to automate security releases for them. This is the selling point to me, right? When someone experienced the first security release and all the nightmare they have to go through as a component, you say, that's automated for you, just merge the thing and we're gonna release.
I think that's going to be a fairly straightforward sell. I think we just need to make sure we know like how we'll help people through that. So
yeah, all of a sudden no one cares about what's the name of their own package, the version. They just say, okay, that's good. That's a good trade-off.
Yeah, I mean, these are our opportunities, right? Like, it's always a shame when teams have a terrible time, but also these are the times where I think we can then step in and actually offer people a better approach, if they can meet the sort of basic requirements we have. Cool. Okay, great. We have 1 minute left. Is there anything else anyone wants to cover quickly on this call? No? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, guys. Like, it's been great chatting. Like, I'll put a summary, I'll fill out the agenda notes a little bit, put a summary on the issue. One thing, Alessio, before you head off this week, would you mind just, and everyone else, but particularly for you, Alessio, would you mind just filling in on my comment or add a comment on the bits where I've left the extra gaps? Because I think you mentioned some of these things to me already, just so we get a bit of a picture. But it's there. I think we're close to having a really tangible OKR, which helps other teams, is visible, but also gives us a chance to push on with some of the foundational stuff we've been doing already. Okay. Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your Thursday.
Bye. Have a good one.
Yeah. Bye.
Definitely. We don't see you before then, Alessio. Have a nice time off and everything as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Graham.